Welcome to Lesson 4.4, all about political parties. In today's lesson, you're going to need to know about what they are, different systems of parties, and a little bit about the status of third parties in America. So there are going to be 5 topics today. Hopefully you take good notes. So our first topic is just what political parties are. They're an association of people or a group of people with common ideas that want to control government. Now this may sound bad, but really what they do is they provide a vehicle for people to connect with government and a way to hold government accountable and responsible to public opinion. So many people might say that political parties are a bad thing because they encourage people to be more divided, but at the same time they also are a way for people to show how they feel about what government policies ought to be. When the founders created the United States, they didn't believe that parties were a good thing. They thought that factions would seize control of America. But in reality, what we found is that our parties provide a stabilizing way of keeping government going. Now, they do have some purposes and activities, specific things they do. They recruit candidates and they support them in an effort to control government. They also educate voters about what the important issues are through advertising and through providing mailings and meetings and things like that. They also organize and control the government through not just candidates who get elected, but also through bureaucrats and low-level employees, and they are the ones who implement many of the policies. Now in the United States we found that there isn't any dues or paid membership for either of the parties, the major parties. Mostly we identify with the party, so all you have to take in order to be a member of the Republican or the Democratic Party is to say that you are one. Now there are some factors that we found that influence people to join one of the two or identify with one of the two parties. Generally a more conservative ideology is aligned with the Republican Party, whereas a more liberal ideology is associated with the Democratic Party. It used to be that wasn't always the case though. You had some very conservative Democrats and some pretty liberal Republicans. We've also found that gender tends to skew towards Democrats if you're female. Race and ethnicity tends to be that ethnic minorities tend to skew toward Democrats. Married people tend to skew toward Republicans. Older people tend to skew towards the Republicans. Younger people skew towards the Democrats. Income tends to be, the higher income tends to be Republican. Religion, the more religious people are, and depending on what religion they are. So for example, evangelical Christians tend to associate with the Republican Party, whereas Jews and Hindus and a couple of other Christian groups also identify with the Democrats. And then finally, what region of the country you're from or what part of the society you live in. So urban areas tend to be more Democratic, whereas rural areas tend to vote more Republican. We've also found that the South has flipped since the 1960s of being controlled almost entirely by Democrats to being almost entirely controlled by Republicans. Likewise, the East and the West Coast tend to be pretty dominated by the Democratic Party. Now we'll move on to the topic of what are known as party systems, which is essentially saying how many political parties does your country normally have. So there are obviously countries that have one-party systems, like for example China, where the only legally permitted party is the Chinese Communist Party. Those tend to lead to considerable amounts of stability, but also dictatorships and lack of human rights. Two-party systems are common in countries like the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. They often have very moderate parties and stability because in order to win half of the votes, you have to incorporate at least some of the middle ground views into your party. So we have that kind of a system, and we'll talk about it in a minute why. There are also some countries, like throughout most of Europe, they have multi-party systems. So for example, in France, there are several political parties that are equally powerful. That's true in the United Kingdom to some extent as well. Other places like Germany, for example, might have 4 or 5 parties that are each vying for control. That tends to create a little bit more instability, and a lot of times these political parties have to join with each other in coalitions in order to try to control the government. But often their governments won't be as strong in terms of their direction of power and their policies that they want to implement because they have to try to agree with other political parties in order to get things done. Now there are a few reasons, like I said, why the United States has a history of a two-party system. Really, it's a historical tradition that dates back to the 1790s that we have two parties. There was only a brief period in the 1810s and 1820s where we didn't really have two political parties, we just had one. We also have an electoral system that favors having two parties. In order to win the Electoral College, for example, you have to have a majority of the electors. So that means that you have to have at least 50% of the votes in some sense of those votes in order to become president. So that lends itself to having two parties. Also, we have one representative per district. So in other words, the person who wins the most most votes in the district becomes the representative. Other countries might have a system whereby one district might be represented by 3 different people, the top 3 vote getters, and that would lend itself to having more political parties, but that's not the system that we have. Finally, we also have election laws that favor having 2 parties. In some states, it's very difficult to get on the ballot unless you have a certain number of signatures of people who claim that they support you, and that tends to be high enough that it eliminates any third parties who might want to become governor or might want to become representative or things like that. So there are some relatively strict election laws that restrict ballot access. Now, as far as the success of third parties in the United States, they're relatively limited. There have only been a few recently in the last 50 years in Congress alone. There's never been a presidential third party winner. And generally they're based on one person's personality or one single issue, or they often are breaking away from a major party due to some major disagreement. So the most recent pretty successful third-party candidate was actually Ross Perot in 1992. He pulled almost 20% of the popular vote in 1992 for president, but he actually didn't win any of the electoral votes. The last time that we had a third-party presidential candidate who won any electoral votes at all was George Wallace in 1968, and there he is, pictured to the bottom right. He broke away from the Democratic Party because he wanted to advocate for more segregation policies. And so that's what we have here today about political parties. Hopefully you've taken good notes, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.